On April 9th, 2009, 42-year-old Abraham Shakespeare drove his fancy black BMW 750i car towards an upscale gated community in Lakeland, Florida. Abraham stopped his car, hit a remote control on his sun visor, and waited for the large gate that kept his neighborhood separated from the rest of the city to open. Then Abraham drove through the gate and glanced in his rearview mirror. His friend, Dee Dee Moore, was following right behind him in her black Hummer. Abraham led Dee Dee through the neighborhood's winding roads that were dotted with large two-story homes with huge front yards and swimming pools in back. Then he pulled into the driveway of his own house that looked a lot like the others in the neighborhood. Abraham parked his car and stepped outside. He was 6 foot 4 inches tall with long, skinny arms and legs. He had a beard and a black spandex cap that covered his dreadlocks. He wore a white t-shirt and jeans. Dee Dee's huge Hummer pulled into the driveway behind the BMW. Dee Dee got out and smiled at Abraham. She was 36 years old, and she was tall with dyed blonde hair, and she laughed and talked a lot. Dee Dee went around to the passenger side of the Hummer, opened the door, and took out a video camera and a tripod to put the camera on. She closed the door and then followed Abraham into his house. And Abraham led her through his living room that had high ceilings, large leather couches, and a state-of-the-art TV. The furniture, and most of the decorations inside, had come with the house when Abraham bought it. Abraham asked Dee Dee how her day at work had been as they walked up the staircase to the second floor. And Dee Dee told him that things were going really well. She owned and operated a successful medical staffing agency, and she said business just kept getting better. Then they walked down a hallway on the second floor into a room that Abraham used as an office and as a place to relax and watch TV. And when they walked into the room, Dee Dee set up the tripod, put the camera on it, and turned the camera on. Then she asked Abraham if he was ready for her to film him. Abraham looked at the camera, he grinned and said yep, he was ready. Since Dee Dee's medical staffing agency had taken off, she had spent a lot of time and energy following her dream of becoming a writer. She wanted to write books and movies. And when Dee Dee and Abraham had met through a mutual friend about 6 months earlier, she was fascinated by his life story. And she thought he would be the perfect subject for a biography or a documentary, or maybe even a Hollywood blockbuster movie. Dee Dee pressed record on the camera and asked Abraham just to talk about himself a little bit and to tell her about his life. Dee Dee thought getting Abraham to tell his story in his own words would be a great resource for her for when she started writing a book or movie about him. So Abraham started talking into the camera and pacing a little back and forth, and as he talked about his life, it seemed like he was almost reliving certain moments from when he was younger. And that made Dee Dee smile. And as she listened, she thought even his last name, Shakespeare, was perfect for a storyteller like Abraham. Abraham had grown up poor, and he had dropped out of school when he was about 12 years old to go work in the citrus fields that thrived in that part of Florida. And Abraham had left school without really learning how to read or write beyond the most basic level. And as he got older, he started to understand that his employment options would always be limited. And so he had spent the majority of his life moving from one odd job to another, trying to make ends meet. In the room upstairs in his house, Abraham stopped pacing for a second, and he thought back to some of the low-paying jobs he'd had. And he said going from job to job and struggling to survive had made it clear to him just how much the city of Lakeland was divided. Lakeland was part of the Tampa Bay area, and in Lakeland, some of the wealthiest people in Florida lived just miles away from some of the poorest people. And Abraham said when he was younger, he would pass by the gated communities where the rich people lived, and he would tell himself that someday he would figure out a way to move behind those gates. But it was a dream that most people in his poor neighborhood laughed at, and for most of Abraham's life, that dream he had seemed like it was impossible to achieve. But even though Abraham had spent decades living in his mom's house and working low-paying jobs, he had refused to let that bring him down. And everybody who knew Abraham said he was one of the kindest, most positive people they had ever met. Then, 3 years earlier, on November 15th of 2006, Abraham had been working as a delivery man for a food distribution company. Abraham's co-worker, Michael Ford, had been driving the delivery truck that day, and he pulled into a convenience store to get cigarettes and a drink. But before Michael got out of the truck, Abraham had reached into his pocket and taken out $2. Abraham was pretty broke at the time, and he knew he shouldn't just throw money away, but he stared at the dollar bills in his hand and then gave them to Michael and asked him to buy 2 quick pick lottery tickets. and Michael laughed, grabbed the money, and went inside. A few minutes later, Michael had gotten back in the truck and given Abraham the 2 lottery tickets. Then, the following evening, Abraham had been sitting on the couch at his mother's house, watching the winning lottery numbers get announced on the local news. And he had just stared at the TV, stunned, because each winning lottery number that just got announced matched a number on a lottery ticket he was holding. At first, as the numbers kept matching over and over again, Abraham had kind of laughed it off and thought, this is not going to happen. But when they were about to announce the final number, he could feel his heart beating faster, because all he needed was one more match. He leaned in close to the TV and watched as the newscaster called out the final winning lottery number. And when Abraham had heard that number, he checked his ticket, then he checked it again and again, and then Abraham jumped off the couch and started shouting to his mother that he had just won the lottery. Abraham's mom came into the room and she thought he was playing a prank. But when he showed her the numbers on the TV and the matching numbers on his ticket, she started screaming and crying because Abraham had hit the $30 million jackpot. Fast forward back to the present, and Abraham smiled into the camera, and Dee Dee smiled too. Just hearing Abraham tell that story about winning the lottery was like listening to somebody describe a miracle, like something that never really actually happens in real life. But then Abraham stared down at the floor, and a look of total exhaustion came across his face. So Dee Dee asked him if he was okay, and Abraham told Dee Dee about what had happened almost immediately after he was shown on the TV collecting his big lottery winnings. Even after a huge amount of taxes and a reduced payout for taking his lottery money immediately instead of over several years, Abraham walked away with about $12 million, more money than he'd ever imagined having in his whole life. And with that money, Abraham had bought his dream house in one of Lakeland's beautiful gated communities for the rich, and he had gotten himself a very fancy car, that BMW. But soon after that, a lot of people had seemed to take advantage of Abraham's kindness. And he was lending money to friends, family, and people he had never met before, and he was paying for their mortgages, healthcare bills, college tuition fees, startup expenses for businesses, and just about anything else people could think of. And Abraham said that he loved helping people, he really did. But over time, it had just gotten more out of control, and now, 2.5 years after he had won the lottery, he said there were days where he would get hundreds of text messages from people asking for money, and he just felt like he couldn't say no to any of them. In fact, Abraham had a cousin named Cedric Edom who owed him thousands of dollars in mortgage payments on a house that Abraham had bought and let Cedric live in. And now Abraham could barely even get Cedric to talk to him, let alone get Cedric to pay back any of the money he owed. And Abraham hated that he felt like his lottery money was coming between him and his friends and family. From behind the camera, Dee Dee asked Abraham if he was tired, and he turned away from the lens, then glanced back and said he'd been tired for a whole year. And he said sometimes he dreamed of running away to a beach in some other country and just disappearing forever. Not long after that, Dee Dee stopped recording. She could tell Abraham was getting upset, and she felt for him. She hadn't won millions of dollars, but she said when her business had taken off, she had her share of people coming out of the woodwork asking her for money. And she knew that even for someone who was as good of a person as Abraham, that pressure could take its toll. And so Abraham and Dee Dee had talked for a little while longer, but not for the camera. And then at some point, Abraham looked around the room and then stared out the window at his sprawling yard. Abraham lived in a place he'd once dreamed about, and now all he wanted to do was get as far away from that house as possible. And after this day, April 9th, 2009, when Abraham and Dee Dee chatted and Abraham spoke for the camera, Abraham just kind of disappeared. And in the days and weeks following this day, Dee Dee, Abraham's mom, and some of his other close friends and family did get occasional text messages from Abraham, but nobody saw him or talked to him on the phone. And in the text messages he sent, Abraham always said that he was doing fine and he just wanted to be left alone, but he never said where he actually was. And so Abraham's apparent decision to just leave without telling anyone really upset his mom. They had always been really close, and she had talked to Abraham almost every day for his entire life. So now only getting a few text messages from him every now and again with kind of sparse information about what he was doing and where he was very difficult for her to deal with. But like Dee Dee, Abraham's mom had seen up close how people constantly came to Abraham for money and how that really weighed on him. And she knew Abraham had started to imagine himself walking on a beach where nobody knew who he was and where nobody would bother him. And so Abraham's mom and his other family and friends didn't try to find him. They just kind of respected that he really just wanted space. But then, fast forward to November 9th, 2009, 7 months after Abraham was last seen by anybody close to him. And on that day, Detective Dave Clark of the Polk County Sheriff's Department was sitting at his desk looking at a report that didn't make sense to him. The Sheriff's Department had gotten a call from Cedric Edom, Abraham's cousin who owed him thousands of dollars. And Cedric had said that his cousin had been missing since April and he wanted to file an official missing persons report. Detective Clark, who had short blonde hair and a goatee, looked really young, but in reality, he had been in law enforcement for years, and he had experience with almost every kind of case. And Clark had a reputation for being one of the best listeners and one of the most objective officers in the entire department. In fact, during interrogations, Clark was known to give suspects every chance to tell their side of a story because he genuinely believed in the assumption that people were innocent until proven guilty. But as much as Clark had seen over the years, and as much as he tried to give people the benefit of the doubt, something about this missing persons report felt really strange to him. If this man was missing, why had his friends and family waited 7 months to tell the police? Clark leaned back in his chair and read over the report again. And this time, when he read the missing person's name, his eyes went wide. He grabbed a piece of paper and pen and started writing down some notes. Because Clark remembered something that he hadn't thought of in years. Clark knew who Abraham Shakespeare was, because after Abraham had hit the lottery jackpot back in 2006, news stations in the area covered what they called Abraham's rags to riches story over and over for weeks. So Clark now knew he was dealing with a potentially missing person who was worth millions and millions of dollars. And when that much money was involved, there was always the possibility of foul play. And so Clark wanted to get to work on this case right away, and he wanted to start his investigation with the man who had filed the missing persons report, because Clark was interested in finding out why, after all this time, Cedric had now decided to come forward and track down his cousin. A few hours later, Detective Clark led Abraham's cousin, Cedric, into an interrogation room at the Sheriff's Department, and Cedric was combative almost from the moment he walked in. He told Clark he didn't understand why he was being questioned, and he said he was the only one who seemed concerned at all about Abraham. But Clark just smiled and asked Cedric to sit down with him at a small table in the cramped, bright room. And then Clark said that they had contacted Cedric and asked him to come in because he was the one who had contacted them. And the police really just wanted to know what was going on with Abraham that had concerned Cedric enough to get in touch with authorities. Cedric took a breath and tried to calm down, but it didn't work. And in a very angry voice, he launched into an attack against a bunch of Abraham's friends, including Dee Dee Moore, and he said they were all really greedy people who took advantage of Abraham. And then Cedric said he was almost positive that one of them had killed Abraham and taken off with his money. Clark listened and let Cedric talk for as long as he wanted. And Clark thought it was a little weird how quickly Cedric had jumped to the conclusion that Abraham had been murdered. But Clark didn't mention that. And when Cedric finally stopped talking, Clark smiled and talked to Cedric almost like they'd been friends for years. Clark said he'd done some research right after getting the missing persons report, and so he knew that Cedric owed Abraham thousands of dollars in mortgage payments on a house that Abraham had bought for him. Cedric shook his head, and the anger in his voice came right back, and he said he loved his cousin, and he reiterated that he was the only one doing anything to find him. By the end of the interview, Clark was even more surprised than he had been by the missing persons report. He didn't have enough evidence to hold Cedric, but he thought if something really had happened to Abraham, Cedric had to be at the top of the suspect list. Here was a guy who hadn't said anything for 7 months, who owed Abraham thousands of dollars, talked about a potential murder, and then immediately tried to put the blame on other people. So Clark couldn't shake the feeling that Cedric might have contacted police in an attempt to cover his own tracks in some way. But Clark was going to remain objective like he always did, yet even if he was potentially connected to Abraham's disappearance, there was also a chance that he was telling the truth. And so maybe there really were friends of Abraham who were out to get his money in any way possible. So later that day, the sheriff's department subpoenaed the cell phone company in order to get a detailed account of Abraham's cell phone records. But Clark knew that could take a while, so he dug further into some of Abraham's financial records, and the list of people who owed him money was astonishing. In the 3 years since Abraham won the lottery, he had loaned millions of dollars to people. And this was just in the form of property expenses, medical bills, educational costs, and other loans that had a clear paper trail. But Clark figured Abraham must have also been handing out money to people in his everyday life that he had not kept records of. So tracking down all the people who owed Abraham money would take time and resources. Clark was willing to do whatever it took, but he still had no evidence, other than Cedric's word, that Abraham was actually missing. Clark needed to get a better idea of what was happening, so he decided to talk directly to one of the people that Cedric had been eager to blame for Abraham's disappearance, Dee Moore. On November 10th, the day after the missing persons report had been filed, Detective Clark found himself back in the interrogation room. This time, he was seated across the table from Dee Moore, Abraham's friend who wanted to write a book and make a movie about his life. Dee had on jeans, a t-shirt, and leather sandals, and Clark thought she was almost the exact opposite of Cedric when it came to interviewing her. She smiled a bunch and seemed very easygoing, and she said she would tell him anything she could, but that she didn't really understand why she was there. So Clark asked her, when was the last time you spoke to Abraham? And she said she had gotten a text from him somewhat recently, and that he messaged her from time to time just to see how things were going in her life and to tell her that he was okay and enjoying his time away. Then Clark took a breath and got a serious look on his face. He looked right at Dee and told her that Abraham's cousin, Cedric, had said he was worried Abraham might be dead. Dee immediately looked confused and said she didn't understand because as far as she knew, she was texting somewhat regularly with Abraham. And as far as she knew, Abraham had done exactly what he said he was going to do: take off to maybe a beach somewhere and never look back. So Clark asked her why Cedric would have filed the missing persons report in the first place and why he might have pointed the finger at her as someone who might have wanted to hurt Abraham. Dee just shook her head, and then she looked at Clark and said she had an idea why Cedric might come after her. Clark smiled, and in his friendly voice, he asked Dee to fill him in. And Dee said that she and Abraham's mom were two of the only people in his life who had pushed Abraham to follow up with everyone who owed him money and make them pay him back. They said it was one thing to be a kind person, but it was another to get taken advantage of. And they told Abraham that just because someone was family, it didn't mean they were entitled to get anything they wanted from him. Clark nodded and asked if that had caused problems in Abraham's life, having people like Cedric around. And Dee's voice got a little louder and rougher, and she said Cedric preyed on good-hearted people. And she knew that as much as Abraham wanted to see the best in others, Cedric would never pay him back a dime. Detective Clark and Dee spoke for a little while longer, and then Clark thanked her for her time, and after she left, he went back to his desk to look at his notes from both of the interviews he'd conducted over the past couple of days. And as he did that, all he could think about was how badly he wanted to see Abraham's cell phone records. Because Clark still didn't know if Abraham was dead in a ditch somewhere, like Cedric wanted him to believe, or if Abraham was just sipping pina coladas on a beach without a care in the world. In the days following his interview with Dee, Clark kept digging into Abraham's financial records, and he and other members of the investigative team met with Abraham's friends, family, and as many people who owed him money as possible. But Clark also discovered something new that caught his interest. Michael Ford, Abraham's co-worker who had used Abraham's money to buy the winning lottery tickets, had filed a lawsuit about a year after Abraham had won the lottery. In that lawsuit, Michael had argued that because he was the one who actually bought the tickets for Abraham, he was entitled to at least a cut of the winnings. But Michael had lost his case in court, and Clark wanted to know if maybe Michael held a grudge against Abraham. So Clark pursued this new potential lead. But he discovered that Michael and Abraham had pretty much lost touch once the trial started, and Abraham had even stated publicly that he didn't blame Michael for doing what he did, and he said he would have been willing to give Michael hundreds of thousands of dollars if Michael had just asked him instead of going directly to the courts. Now, none of this ruled out Michael as a suspect in Clark's mind, but there was no evidence putting Michael anywhere near Abraham in the days and weeks before Abraham had apparently disappeared. So Clark knew he needed to keep looking elsewhere. And Clark still felt like he was in the middle of one of the most bizarre cases he'd ever dealt with, because no evidence had surfaced that suggested anything violent or against the law had even happened to Abraham. There was no body, there was no signs of distress at his house, and friends and family kept getting text messages from him. So Clark kept reminding himself that Abraham was a guy with the financial means to truly just disappear if he wanted to. But then, at the end of the month, something happened that would turn Detective Clark's attention back to one suspect in particular. On a day in late November, Abraham's mom contacted Detective Clark and said she had something to show him. So Clark drove out to her house, and Abraham's mom met him at the door and invited him inside. The house was warm and comfortable, and being there, Clark felt even more of an urge to discover where Abraham was, just so he could put Abraham's mom's mind at ease. Clark thanked Abraham's mom for calling him and for welcoming him into her house. Then she led him into the living room and picked up an envelope from the coffee table. She opened it and showed Clark a greeting card with a Christian cross on the front. And she said when she'd gotten this card, there had been a $100 bill inside of it. She handed the card to Clark and he opened it, and he saw a scribbled note that said, "I'll be home soon," and Abraham's signature underneath. And Abraham's mom said that even though her son had trouble writing, he had always made sure he could sign his name, and she recognized that was definitely his signature on the card. Abraham's mom told Clark that she had gotten the letter about 2 months earlier, but she had forgotten about it. She said she was sorry she had not shown it to him sooner. Clark said that was totally fine, and that he was grateful that she was showing it to him now. And he picked up the envelope that the card had come in, and he squinted his eyes, almost like he was trying to look for something that wasn't there, because there was no stamp or address on the envelope, and it didn't look like it had been mailed from anywhere. So Clark asked Abraham's mom how she'd actually gotten the letter, and she told him her nephew, Abraham's cousin, Cedric, had hand-delivered it. Just hearing that made Clark feel like his investigation had gone right back to where it started. Then, without Clark saying anything, Abraham's mom said that even though Cedric was her nephew, she didn't always trust him. And she didn't necessarily believe he was just trying to do right by Abraham by filing the missing persons report. And then she looked Clark in the eyes and told him all she really wanted was to hear from her son. If she could just hear his voice, she would know he was okay and everything would be fine. Clark said he understood, and he thanked Abraham's mom for all her help and told her he would keep her informed if he learned anything new. Then Clark went back to the station and he told other members of the investigative team that he wanted to keep looking into Abraham's cousin, Cedric, because giving Abraham's mom a card with $100 and Abraham's signature in it seemed like one more way Cedric could be trying to cover something up. And then Clark got some information that he was confident would break the case wide open. The phone company had come back and they provided police with a detailed history of text messages sent from Abraham's number. And something in those text messages stood out to Clark right away. And by December, Clark believed he was closer than ever to finding Abraham. On December 26, 2009, so a month and a half after the missing persons report was filed, Abraham's mother was relaxing on the couch at her house. Christmas had been a mixed blessing that year. She loved seeing friends and family for the holidays, but not having Abraham around just hadn't felt right. They had always spent Christmas together, and so the house kind of felt empty without him. But then her phone rang. She leaned over, grabbed it off the coffee table, and almost started crying tears of joy, because Abraham was calling. The connection wasn't great, but she could hear her son on the other line, and that was all that mattered. Abraham wished her a Merry Christmas and said he was sorry he hadn't called the day before. And Abraham's mom said that was okay, and that she just wanted to know how he was doing. And he said, other than dealing with a little winter cold, he'd been great. And he knew him leaving had been very hard on people, especially her, but he felt like he'd made the right choice. And he promised he'd be home soon, and when he did, he'd be much happier than when he left. Abraham's mom hung up the phone, and she felt better than she had in months. And she wanted to call everyone she knew to let them know the good news. She had finally heard from Abraham. She had heard his voice. But first, she thought she needed to tell the police. So she took a deep breath, collected herself, and called the sheriff's department. On December 26th, right after Abraham's mom had gotten this call from her son, Detective Clark was sitting at his desk. His phone rang, and he picked it up, and he could hear Abraham's mom almost shouting at him on the other line. She told him about the phone call she'd just received from Abraham and how happy she was, and so Clark thanked her for letting him know, he wished her a Merry Christmas, and then hung up. But then, he immediately made a call to the cell phone company so he could get a location on where Abraham's phone had been when he placed this call to his mother. And when Clark heard what they had to say, he shouted across the room to a fellow detective and told him they needed to leave immediately. Clark and this other detective ran out of the station. They climbed into an unmarked car. Clark sat in the passenger seat and the other detective drove, and before long they were peeling out of the parking lot and heading onto the street. It was a mild winter day in Florida, about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, but the sun was bright and Clark could feel himself sweating a little from the adrenaline rush. Minutes later, they pulled off the road and into a parking lot of a huge shopping mall. And when they arrived, Clark and the other detective saw the man they were looking for sitting in a parked car nearby. But before the detectives could get out of their car, the man they were looking for drove off. And so Clark looked over at the other detective and just said, "Chase him." So the detective peeled out of the mall parking lot and raced down the street after this man in the car. But the detectives realized they didn't have police sirens in their unmarked vehicle, so they couldn't signal to the driver that they were cops and they wanted to pull him over. So the detective just tried to stay as close to the man they were chasing as possible. Then finally they came to a red light and the man they were after stopped, and so without even thinking, Detective Clark threw open his door, he ran in front of this car, he held up his badge, and he yelled at the driver to get out and come with them. The man in this car just stared up at Clark, and then he slumped his shoulders and put his head down. And later that day, after they had all talked back at the sheriff's station, Detective Clark knew where Abraham Shakespeare had been all this time. Based on interviews and cell phone data collected throughout the missing persons investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on April 9th, 2009, when Abraham first disappeared. On that night, Abraham drove his car down a road in an upscale neighborhood in a town about 20 minutes away from his house in Lakeland. Abraham had spent much of the day talking to Dee Dee on camera, and he was still thinking about getting away from Florida and kind of dropping off the map for a while. But before he did anything drastic, he wanted to make sure he had enough cash on hand to just disappear. And he hoped to avoid leaving a paper trail as much as possible, so it would be harder for people to track him down. So Abraham was on his way to the house of someone who owed him money and who had told Abraham that they had thousands of dollars in cash that they could give him. While Abraham wound his way through the neighborhood, the person he was going to see sat inside their house and waited for Abraham to arrive. And a few minutes later, they saw the headlights from Abraham's BMW outside. So they went to the front door, stood in the doorway, and waved to Abraham as he stepped out of his car. When Abraham got to the door, the person he was meeting with could tell that Abraham seemed down. But they said hopefully getting some cash would cheer him up. Abraham smiled and walked inside and followed this person through their living room and into a small home office. Abraham stood in the middle of the office, and the person he was meeting with walked across the room to a floor safe standing in the corner. Then that person crouched down, they entered the combination for the lock and opened the safe. And then they just waited there for a second. Abraham asked if everything was okay, and this person said, "Yep, everything's fine. I just need to make sure I grab the right amount of money." Then this person reached into the safe, slowly stood up, turned around, and aimed a gun right at Abraham. A look of fear came across Abraham's face, but before he could turn to run, the person shot him right in the chest, and blood began to stain his white t-shirt. Then the person fired again, and this bullet grazed Abraham's heart and perforated his lung. The shooter casually walked across the room and stood over Abraham, and they watched and listened as Abraham slowly died. Then the killer put the gun back in the safe. Then they went back to Abraham's body, crouched down, took his phone out of his pocket, and slipped it into their own pocket. Then they grabbed Abraham's legs and dragged him out of the room. Abraham was skinny, but he was very tall, so dragging him through the house was not easy. But eventually they managed to pull Abraham to the back door, and then they dragged him out into the backyard. A fence surrounded the yard, and it was totally dark out there except for some moonlight. So the killer did not feel like anyone could see them, so they didn't rush. They bent over, caught their breath, and then picked up a shovel that was laying in the grass. Then they started digging a hole in the middle of the yard. Finally, when the hole was deep enough, they walked over to Abraham's body, grabbed him by the legs, dragged him across the yard, and dumped him into the hole. Then they took the shovel and filled the hole back in. Later that night, they cleaned the bloodstains from inside their house and out in the yard, and then they found a phone number of a construction company that they planned to call the next day to place a concrete slab over the hole where they had just buried Abraham. Then the killer went into the living room, hooked up their video camera to the television, and watched the recording they had made with Abraham earlier that day. Dee Dee Moore, Abraham's friend who was an aspiring writer, had murdered Abraham. It turned out that months before the murder, she had convinced Abraham to give her control of his finances, and she had promised to play the bad guy and collect money from all of Abraham's friends and family who owed him. And she even agreed to hold on to a large amount of Abraham's cash for him in her safe so he wouldn't be tempted to just hand it out to people who asked him for money. And because Dee Dee was a successful business owner, Abraham had believed she would be better at managing money and collecting debts than he could ever be. So he thanked Dee Dee for her help and put her in charge of millions of dollars in cash and assets. And Dee Dee had collected money from people who owed Abraham, but instead of giving the money to Abraham, she kept it for herself. And she spent that money and some of the cash Abraham had given her on a brand new huge Hummer vehicle and other expensive items she wanted. And for months, Dee Dee had gotten away with it without anyone suspecting anything. But then, in the spring of 2009, not long before the murder, one of Abraham's friends started to catch on to what Dee Dee was doing. Because even though he was making regular payments to Dee Dee to clear his debts with Abraham, she kept asking him for more money. And when he got angry and said he had already paid what he owed, Dee Dee worried he would tell Abraham, and Abraham would find out that she had been stealing his money. So Dee Dee decided she would just get rid of Abraham, but keep collecting the money people owed him for herself. But in order to do that, she had to make it seem like Abraham was alive and just wanted his distance. And so when she filmed him on her camera, claiming it was for her book and movie, even though in reality she had no aspirations to write Abraham's story, she intentionally steered the conversation to how tired and frustrated he must be, and when Abraham talked about wanting to escape to a foreign beach, Dee Dee knew it was time to put her plan into motion. So she told Abraham to come to her house to get thousands of dollars in cash that she'd been holding for him in her safe, and when he arrived, she killed him and then used his phone to text his friends and family, and then she showed some of his friends and family the video recording of Abraham where he was talking about how he wanted to leave Florida and go to a beach somewhere and just kind of disappear and be left alone. And so naturally, his friends and family believed that that was what happened to Abraham. He had chosen to kind of go away. And Dee Dee almost got away with it. But once Abraham was dead, Dee Dee became relentless in her pursuit of his cousin Cedric, and she called Cedric and came to his house all the time, demanding he pay back all of the money he owed Abraham, and Cedric just wasn't going to do that. And so finally, Cedric got fed up with Dee Dee, and he filed a missing persons report. Now, Cedric did not actually believe that Abraham was dead, but by alleging that he had been murdered and pointing at Dee Dee as potentially the murderer, he knew that would launch a police investigation into Dee Dee, and that would get her off of his back for at least a while. And when Detective Clark got a record of Abraham's text messages, he was shocked at how well written and how formal they were. After all, he knew that Abraham still struggled with reading and writing. Then, when Abraham supposedly called his mother on the day after Christmas, Detective Clark got confirmation that what he believed had been going on was going on. Somebody in town had been using Abraham's phone and had been pretending to be him. And when Clark traced Abraham's phone to the mall parking lot, he and the other detective saw Dee Dee leaning into a car, handing over cash to a man and taking a phone back from him. And when they chased that man down, he admitted that he was a friend of Abraham's who Dee Dee had paid to call Abraham's mom and pretend to be Abraham. And the man had told Abraham's mom on this call that he was fighting a winter cold to make up for the fact that he didn't really sound like Abraham. Not long after that, Abraham's cousin Cedric came back to the sheriff's station, and he admitted that someone had paid him to deliver the greeting card that Abraham supposedly wrote to his mother. And it would turn out that the money Cedric was paid to make that delivery could be traced back to Dee Dee. And so Cedric had been right about Dee Dee all along without actually knowing it. With all of this new information, and with Abraham's phone records, police determined that every text message that had been sent from Abraham's phone since he disappeared had actually been sent by Dee Dee. And eventually, they learned that Dee Dee had hired a construction company to lay a concrete slab down in her backyard. So, on January 27, 2010, over 9 months after Abraham's murder, police went to Dee Dee's house, and they broke up the concrete slab out back, dug up the ground underneath, and found the skeletal remains of Abraham Shakespeare. And pieces of the t-shirt and jeans that Abraham had been wearing in the video that Dee Dee recorded on the day she killed him were still clinging to his bones. Dee Dee was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Abraham was given a proper burial, and his family was finally able to grieve. And his murder helped lead to a new Florida law that keeps the identities of large jackpot lottery winners private for 90 days. And in a telephone interview from prison, Dee Dee surprised reporters and said she strongly supported this new law. In 1993, David Lewis was an accomplished lawyer living in Amarillo, Texas, with his wife Karen and his 9-year-old daughter. He was known to be a devoted husband and father who spent much of his off time supporting various charitable causes. On January 28th of that year, Karen and their daughter decided to leave Amarillo and go to Dallas to spend the weekend shopping together. David, who would normally go with them, decided to stay home because he did not want to miss the Super Bowl, which was that Sunday, the 31st. So Karen and their daughter left, and then a couple of days later, on the 31st, they returned to Amarillo, and they actually got back to their house right after the Super Bowl had ended. And so they anticipated going into the house and finding David either cleaning up after himself or maybe watching the post-game. But when they walked in, the TV was still on and turned to the channel the Super Bowl had been on, but David was nowhere to be found. Karen noticed that the VCR was actually still recording. David was known to record all major sports games and watch them again, and so clearly he had not turned off the recording. As Karen walked around the house yelling for her husband, she wasn't that concerned. She figured he must have stepped out or something, but she went into the kitchen and she opened up the fridge and she found there was a plate with 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches on it, which was a sandwich David would often make. And she thought that was pretty weird that he would have made them and then let them sit inside the fridge. And so she closed the fridge and turned around, and on the counter in the kitchen was his wedding band and his watch. And so even though there were all these kind of strange things that Karen was finding in the house, she really wasn't that concerned. There was no sign of forced entry, there was no sign the house had been burglarized, there was no sign of a struggle, and so she assumed her husband must have stepped out to watch the second half of the game at a friend's house and that he would be back later. And so Karen stayed up for a little while, but then ultimately she went to bed thinking he would be there in the morning. But the next morning when she got up, there was no sign of her husband, and so she went to the police. Within 24 hours, the police located David's abandoned car downtown near the courthouse. Under one of the car's floor mats, they located his car keys as well as his house keys. And then within the car, they found his checkbook, his credit cards, and his driver's license, all in the places they should be. They looked into his bank activity, and they saw there was a recent deposit for $5,000 into his family's account. They also saw that he recently purchased 2 plane tickets. One was from Los Angeles to Dallas, and the other was from Dallas to Amarillo, but it wasn't clear if he had used either of these tickets. When Karen was told about the found car and the strange bank activity, she told police that her husband had recently told her that he actually thought he might be in danger, because he was scheduled to give a deposition in Dallas later that month in a conflict of interest case between his old law firm and a wealthy client. And David was being pressured to cover up some of the wrongdoings of his previous law firm, and he just wasn't willing to do that. He told his family that he was going to tell the truth no matter who it hurt. David understood that put a huge target on his back. While police were certainly intrigued at this new information, they didn't have any evidence to support the idea that someone was actively trying to silence David. It was just a conspiracy. And so for 11 months, they looked for new leads and new information, but nothing came out, and David never popped up. He never called home. There was no sign of him. And so after 11 months, the police decided that David must have left of his own accord and that there was no foul play here, and so they closed the case. And after that, David's family unfortunately just had to accept the fact that he was gone and that more than likely no one was ever going to find him again. But in 2004, a state trooper in Washington state was on the internet just researching unsolved mysteries, and he came across a picture of David Lewis. And immediately he recognized that he looked exactly like an unidentified victim of a hit-and-run case he covered back in 1993. And so he pulled up the details of this hit and run, and he found the victim had been struck a day after David Lewis had gone missing. When this John Doe got hit, he was dressed head to toe in military clothing, he had no bags, he had no ID, and he was walking aimlessly down Highway 24 in Washington state, so 1,600 miles away from Amarillo, Texas, where David Lewis had gone missing. But despite the enormous distance between these two events, this trooper was convinced David Lewis was this John Doe. But as he's looking at the picture of David Lewis, he realizes he has glasses and he didn't think the John Doe was wearing glasses. But just to be sure, he checked the belongings list of the John Doe and it said he did have glasses. And it was the exact same kind that David was wearing in the picture. And eventually, DNA would confirm that David Lewis was the John Doe. Now, this solved the mystery of where David Lewis went, but it did not solve the mystery of why he went there. Why did David go to Washington, a place where he has no ties? And if David was the one who hit record on his VCR on the night of the Super Bowl, that means he would have only had less than 24 hours to move 1,600 miles to Washington state without his car. And why was he wearing military clothing? Was that his clothing? Did he buy it? Did someone make him wear it? Where was his luggage? What was he doing walking down the highway? David's assertions to his wife that his life was in danger, his demeanor as a loving family man, and the nature of his job as an attorney has many people, his family included, believing that he was the victim of foul play. But officially, the police have said David left the house of his own accord and his death was ruled an accident. Our next story is called Single Blow. In 1996, Blair Adams was 31 years old and living in Surrey, British Columbia. Although in the past he had struggled with substance abuse and alcoholism, over the previous 2 years he had really gotten his act together and got a great job as a foreman at a local construction company. He was known to be a cheerful and friendly guy that did not have any known enemies. But that summer, Blair started exhibiting uncharacteristic mood swings that his mother would describe as being frequent and wild. In a matter of weeks, Blair transformed from being very calm and relaxed and friendly to being totally panicked all the time and always looking over his shoulder, and he was so stressed out he couldn't sleep at night. And he began telling his coworkers that he was fairly certain someone was trying to kill him. And they would say to him, "Blair, I don't think you're okay. You really need to see a doctor." When his mother confronted him about his erratic, paranoid behavior, he told her, "Mom, I really shouldn't tell you about it." And she said, "What's it?" And he said, "Mom, I can't say anything else." And that was it. She could never get any more information out of her son. Blair's strange behavior came to a head on Friday, July 5th, when he went to his bank and withdrew all of the cash out of his account, totaling $6,000, and he also emptied his safety deposit box, which contained thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and gold. 2 days later, on Sunday, he left his house and drove 30 minutes to the Canada-USA border, and he attempted to enter the United States. But being a single guy carrying a bunch of cash and jewelry and acting really nervous, he fit the profile of a drug trafficker, and so he was denied entry. Frustrated, Blair left and went back to his house, and the next day, which was Monday, he went to his construction site and he abruptly told his boss that he was quitting. And he didn't even pick up his final paycheck, he just left. After leaving the construction site, he went straight to the airport where he promptly purchased a $1,600 round trip to Frankfurt, Germany. Although we don't know why he wanted to go to Frankfurt, Germany, he did work there briefly the year before. His flight was supposed to leave the following day, which was Tuesday, but immediately after purchasing this plane ticket, Blair suddenly decided that he needed to try again to cross into the USA. So he rushed to a friend's house, he knocked on her door, She opens it up and he looks totally disheveled, and he's telling her that someone's trying to kill me. I need your help getting across the border. I just got rejected a couple of days ago. Can you please drive me across? You got kids. It'll look much more convincing. Can you do that for me? And she was really spooked by his behavior and felt like this is not something I want to get involved with. And so she said, sorry, I can't help you. So Blair headed home where he hid out for the day. And then the next day, Tuesday, he went to the airport, but instead of getting on his flight to Frankfurt, Germany, he went to the front desk and requested a refund, and it was granted. He told them that the person he was going to meet in Germany had gotten sick, and so now he couldn't go. And so the only person he could have been talking about was the girl he had briefly had a fling with when he was there for work the year earlier. But later on, investigators would talk to that German girl, and she would say she was not in touch with Blair, and she definitely was not expecting him. Blair left the airport and rented a car, which was a Nissan Altima, and he immediately went to the US-Canada border, except this time he was able to get across. He made his way to Seattle, Washington, where he went over to their airport and then abandoned his Nissan in the middle of a parking lot and then went down and bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. Now, he paid $770 for this one-way ticket, but he could have just purchased a round trip for half the price. But either way, he boarded the plane that night, and by Wednesday morning, he was in Washington, D.C. He got off the plane and rented another car, which was a Toyota Camry, and then drove 500 miles southwest to Knoxville, Tennessee. Blair was not seen in Knoxville until about 5:30 p.m. that evening when he showed up at a gas station complaining of car troubles. And so the gas station attendant came out to try to help Blair, and he immediately diagnosed what the problem was. Blair was trying to start his Toyota Camry with the key to his Nissan Altima that he had abandoned in Seattle, Washington. And so the attendant pointed out that it was the wrong key, and Blair held it up and said, no, this is the one I was using. And the guy's like, no, it clearly says Nissan on it. And so Blair and this gas station attendant look around the car inside and out for this missing Toyota key. Blair's reaching in his pockets. He can't find it. Blair ends up calling the rental company, but they wind up being closed. And so the gas station attendant says, unfortunately, we're going to have to tow your car, but I'll give you a ride to a nearby hotel. And so Blair accepted the ride. And just after 6 p.m. that night, Blair walked through the front door of the Fairfield Inn and then promptly turned around and walked out, and then walked in and then walked out. Over and over again, 5 separate times over the course of an hour before he finally walked up to the front desk and asked for a room. The front desk attendant at the hotel said Blair was totally paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder and just totally on edge the entire time. And then after she gave him his room and he paid for it, he took the key and instead of going up to his room, he just walked out again and then never came back. The following morning, 2 workers arrived at their construction site right across the street from the Fairfield Inn, and they discovered a body, and it would turn out to be Blair's. He was missing his socks, shoes, and pants, and he had scratches on his hands as well as on his face, but none of the abrasions were that significant. There was $4,000 in German, US, and Canadian currencies lying on the ground around him. Also spread out around Blair was his fanny pack full of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and gold, a black duffel bag that contained maps and receipts, and then also that missing Toyota car key that they could not find the night before. That was lying on the ground as well. Blair's autopsy showed that he had died from a single violent blow to his stomach, but they had no idea what actually struck his stomach. Toxicology reports showed that Blair had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The only DNA evidence that was found at the crime scene was a single long strand of hair that Blair was clutching in his fist. But there's no more information about this hair online. There were no witnesses, but there was a security guard who claimed to have heard screaming, a woman's scream coming from the area where Blair was discovered at about 3:30 in the morning. The only lead police had was the sketch of this guy that apparently people had seen Blair talking to outside of a Cracker Barrel restaurant right after Blair had left the hotel. But police were never able to identify this man. Investigators were baffled. Was Blair telling the truth that someone had been trying to kill him for weeks leading up to his death and they finally caught up to him? And if so, why didn't he tell authorities? Or was Blair delusional and he just happened to run into another killer when he was in Tennessee? Unfortunately, we still have absolutely no idea. The next and final story of today's episode is called Riddle Me This. At around 5 o'clock in the evening on June 25th, 1999, a man named Ricky McCormick stumbled into an emergency room in St. Louis, Missouri, with his hand over his chest, complaining that he couldn't breathe. He said he had asthma, and earlier that day he had been cutting the grass, and so maybe that had caused a flare-up. But either way, here he was in a lot of discomfort saying, I need help. Ricky was 41 years old, and for his whole life, he had had heart and lung problems, and so him arriving in this state in the ER was actually not all that uncommon for him. And so this hospital did what they did with anyone who came in complaining that they couldn't breathe. They immediately took Ricky to a back exam room, and they hooked him up to all these monitors to make sure his heartbeat was steady and that his oxygen levels were plenty high. And once Ricky was in the exam room getting hooked up, he started acting really agitated, and he kept looking around the room like he was scared that someone was going to jump out at him. And he was also sweating profusely, and whenever he did speak, he spoke so quickly no one could really understand him. But despite Ricky's odd behavior, the heart monitor showed his heart was beating steadily, his oxygen levels were perfectly fine, and when the doctor came in and examined Ricky, even though he clearly saw that something was off about Ricky, there wasn't any sign that there was anything physically wrong with Ricky. And so the doctor and the nurses agreed that whatever was going on with Ricky had to be psychological. And as it happened, Ricky did have a long history of psychological issues. He was known for making things up all the time, just telling people these crazy stories about himself, like how he was this talented singer and he was about to go on tour, or that he was actually a prince, or that he was studying to be a doctor. I mean, things that nobody thought was true, but Ricky would say as if this is just common knowledge. This is who I am. And so Ricky's family for the longest time had just assumed that Ricky was either bipolar or maybe schizophrenic. Those are both serious mental health disorders that totally disrupt normal thinking. But Ricky, despite being encouraged by his friends and family to go get help, never got help for any of his psychological issues. And so Ricky's life had kind of gone off the rails. He had dropped out of high school and not gone back to any sort of schooling, and he had spent some time in jail. Now, Ricky was living in a low-income, very dangerous part of St. Louis, which is a big Midwestern city on the Mississippi River, that in 1999 had a very serious issue with gang violence. Ricky absolutely hated it there, but he had no way to actually leave St. Louis. In fact, Ricky didn't even have his own place. He bounced around from his mother's place, his aunt's place, and his girlfriend's place. Ricky did work, but the work was very sporadic, and it was for the most part just night shifts for random odd jobs. And when Ricky was actually working, he really just spent his time chain smoking cigarettes and drinking literally gallons of coffee. Back at the ER, Ricky, who was still in the exam room, had only been there for less than an hour when the doctor came back in and told Ricky that he was okay and he was going to be discharged. Now, Ricky immediately said, No, I have to be here tonight. I need to stay here. You need to admit me. But the doctor just kind of ignored what he said and handed him the discharge paperwork. 15 minutes later, when a nurse came back into the exam room to get this paperwork from Ricky, she would walk in and see Ricky still sitting on the exam bed, kind of fidgeting around, looking down at this paperwork on his lap that immediately she saw he had not filled out. He had just signed his name at the bottom. And when she walked in, Ricky looked up at her and he kind of shrugged his shoulders and looked at her and was like, I don't know how to read or write. Can you help me? And so the nurse immediately felt bad for Ricky. I mean, he's got dirty clothes on. He looks thin and frail. He's clearly very down on his luck. There's some issues happening with this guy, and he can't even fill out his discharge paperwork. And so she said, no problem. She sat down with him, and together they filled out his paperwork. And then afterwards, when she walked him out of the exam room back to the front of the hospital, Ricky turned to her and said, instead of going home, can you just let me stay here in the lobby just for tonight? And this nurse, who knew she was not allowed to do this, she looked around and saw it was not a busy night there. And so she said, okay, as long as you don't bother anyone, you can stay here. And so Ricky thanked her repeatedly, and then walked over to the corner kind of far away from the front desk and far away from the front door, and he sat down and folded his arms, and then he just stared at the front door. And so this nurse assumed that Ricky actually must be homeless, especially based on, how he came in and how he was acting. And so she figured, he needs a place that's warm to stay tonight. And so the nurse went back to her station, and over the course of the next several hours, she would periodically look out into the lobby, expecting to see Ricky kind of curled up asleep in the corner. But every time she looked out there, Ricky was still sitting upright, arms folded, staring at the front door of the hospital, as if he was expecting someone to come in at any moment and he needed to be ready. And so she thought this was unusual, but she decided not to intervene. She just let him sit there and do his thing. Later that morning, at 11:30 a.m., when the nice nurse who had allowed Ricky to stay in the lobby was leaving her shift, another crew of nurses came in, and right away they noticed Ricky was just sitting in the corner for no apparent reason. And when they walked up to him to ask if he was okay, what are you doing here? What can we do for you? Ricky, instead of trying to talk to any of these nurses, just got up and walked out of the hospital. After leaving the hospital, Ricky walked to a nearby payphone and he called his girlfriend, Sandy. And when Sandy picked up the phone, she immediately recognized her boyfriend's very familiar voice, but she also picked up that he sounded really tired and kind of out of it. And so when she asked him, are you okay? What's going on? Ricky would tell her that he had just spent the night in the hospital. But he didn't clarify that he had spent the night in the lobby of the hospital, not admitted as a patient at the hospital. But to Sandy, it really didn't matter because already this was raising red flags for her, because this was actually the second time that Ricky had gone to the ER just that week. Just a few days earlier, Ricky had been released from a different hospital in St. Louis after telling doctors there that he had had these chest pains and he couldn't breathe. And so he had been admitted for a couple of days, but ultimately they determined that there really was nothing wrong with him. And they too believed whatever was happening with him had to be psychological. And so he had been released. Additionally, Sandy had been growing increasingly worried about Ricky because over the last several weeks, Ricky had begun acting really paranoid, to the point where anytime he was in her apartment and somebody outside the apartment just walked down the hallway, Ricky would jump as if he was worried whoever was out there was going to barge in at any moment. But whenever Sandy asked Ricky, what's going on? Why are you so paranoid? He refused to elaborate. So, feeling very concerned about Ricky, on this phone call, Sandy would say to Ricky, please come to my apartment and let me take care of you. If you're not feeling well, I'll make you feel better. Just please come to my apartment right now. But Ricky said no, he did not want to go to Sandy's apartment. He told her instead he was going to walk to a nearby gas station to get a bite to eat, and then afterwards he would give Sandy a call. And so the two of them agreed to this plan. They hung up, but then Ricky did not call Sandy later. A worker at the gas station where Ricky said he was going would later tell authorities that Ricky did come into the gas station and he got a hot dog on that day, the 26th. And then the next day, this same worker said, yep, we saw Ricky again on the 27th. He came in here, he got a bite to eat, and then he left. But after that, nobody saw Ricky. Not his aunt, not his mom, not his girlfriend. He didn't show up in any other emergency rooms in Missouri. He just disappeared. On June 30th, so 3 days after Ricky was last seen at this gas station, a woman was driving her car 20 miles north of St. Louis on this highway when she looked out into this cornfield that butted up against the highway, and she saw kind of in the middle of it was this dark shape that looked totally out of place. And so she was intrigued enough that she actually pulled over on the road, she got out, and began walking into this cornfield to see what this thing was. And when she got up to this thing and saw what it was, she froze in horror, and then she screamed, turned around, and ran back to her car, and she flew to the nearest gas station. She grabbed a payphone, and she called 911. When the police arrived at this cornfield, they too walked out towards this dark thing, and then finally they saw what this thing was that had scared this woman. It was a dead person who was lying face down, their body was very badly decomposed, and in fact, their body was just kind of falling apart, like the fingers of this person's body had just kind of crumpled off of their hands. Now, based on what this person was wearing, they appeared to be male, but there was no way to tell how this person died or really how long they had been dead for. But despite the advanced decomposition, authorities were able to get a good fingerprint, and it would turn out that this body belonged to Ricky McCormick. The day after Ricky's body was found, the police would come out and say they were treating his death as a homicide. This area along this highway in this cornfield was actually a fairly common place for murderers to dump their victims. And it was very unlikely that Ricky had gotten there by himself. He didn't have a car. In fact, he didn't even have a driver's license. There was no public transportation that could have brought him to this spot. And if Ricky had decided to walk to this area for some reason, it was a solid 15 miles from where he lived and worked. Also, Ricky's body was way too decomposed relative to when he had last been seen alive, just 3 days earlier. And so there was a theory that perhaps he was killed somewhere else and then kept indoors in heat, and that had accelerated his decomposition, and that at some point whoever had killed him had moved his body and dumped it in this cornfield. And so on that first day of the homicide investigation, July 1st, the police put 18 detectives, so a ton of detectives, on this case, and they also appealed to the public to come forward if you had any information about what could have happened to Ricky McCormick. But just a day later, on July 2nd, the police came out and made an announcement that, after looking at all the evidence and looking at Ricky's body again, it did not appear, in fact, that he had been murdered, but instead he must have died of natural causes. This is a guy that had lung and heart problems, and so that is likely what killed him. Case closed. And so after this announcement, all of the evidence in Ricky's case was bundled up, put into storage, and people just kind of forgot about it. 6 months later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, got a tip that involved Ricky McCormick. They were working on a case in St. Louis, Missouri about this major drug dealer who apparently was ordering hits on his rivals, and a confidential informant came forward and told the FBI that this guy, Ricky McCormick, had gotten wrapped up with this major drug dealer. But they didn't really know what role Ricky was playing with this drug dealer. It was just kind of a rumor on the street that, Ricky was involved somehow. This did not make any sense to the FBI because they're thinking, why would this big-time drug dealer who really was a mover and shaker in St. Louis get involved with this guy, Ricky McCormick, who was obviously deeply mentally ill and borderline homeless? I mean, what role could Ricky play for this drug dealer? But the FBI still did follow up on this tip because it was very credible. And when they spoke to the local police who had investigated Ricky's death, they got Ricky's file, which meant they got all of the evidence, and immediately the FBI realized the local police had overlooked a very strange piece of evidence found in Ricky's pocket. This strange evidence was quickly sent to FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, and it landed on the desk of a forensic analyst named Dan Olson. Dan was relatively new to the FBI, but he was highly disciplined and very methodical. And so when he received this piece of evidence, he got to work right away trying to figure out what it was, what it meant in relationship to Ricky and this drug dealer. Maybe does it answer the question of how these people are connected? But despite his best efforts in calling in the experts and using every computer program to analyze this evidence, he just could not figure out what it meant. At the same time that Dan was doing this, the big drug dealer who was the target of that big FBI investigation in St. Louis was arrested on gun and drug charges, and so the big case was now over. And suddenly, trying to figure out what connection Ricky McCormick had to this drug dealer was kind of irrelevant because the drug dealer was behind bars and Ricky was already dead. And so the FBI kind of put a pause on trying to figure out what this evidence was. And so Dan, even though he was really curious now, he was fully invested in trying to figure out what this thing was, he realized he had to give it up too and move on to something else. And so the strange evidence went back into storage, and once again, everyone just kind of moved on from Ricky McCormick. But Dan never really forgot about this mystifying piece of evidence. It was always in the back of his mind. 22 years later, Dan Olson had now become very senior at the FBI. He was actually in charge of their cryptanalysis and racketeering unit. Basically, he was in charge of the people at the FBI who specialized in code breaking, meaning they were the people that would pull any sort of secret messages embedded inside of evidence. And so at some point after taking over this unit, Dan pulled out of storage this strange piece of evidence connected to Ricky McCormick, and he said, you know what? I just need to know what this means. I have to figure it out. I've never been able to. It's haunted me ever since. And so Dan went public. He went to the media and he asked the world to take a look at this mystifying piece of evidence and come forward if you have any idea what it means. When Ricky was discovered in that cornfield, the local police quickly emptied his pockets, and in his pants pocket were 2 documents that contained an incredibly complex cipher or code. It was basically 30 lines on each piece of paper with different symbols and letters and capital letters. I mean, it looked like total gibberish to the untrained eye. But to people like Dan and his code-breaking team, these symbols and letters could mean there was a secret message hidden inside of these documents if you could break the code system. But of course, no one could ever break that code. So how in the world does a guy like Ricky, who is basically functionally illiterate and can only write his name, he's clearly mentally ill and he's not really in touch with reality all the time, how does a guy like that come to be in possession of these complex ciphers? And if he didn't write these ciphers, because that's possible, maybe somebody else gave them to Ricky, well, why would anyone who came up with this very complex cipher entrust a guy like Ricky to be the one to carry these things around? I mean, presumably, they contain confidential information that's been very carefully hidden inside of the cipher. And so why give it to Ricky? He's such a liability. And also, what happened to Ricky in that cornfield? I mean, we don't even know how he got there. We don't know how he was killed. All we know is that he had these ciphers in his pocket when he was found. And so many people believe, including law enforcement, that the answer to, what happened to Ricky and what was his connection to this drug lord in St. Louis, if any, or, what was he up to, will all be solved if we can just figure out what these 2 ciphers mean. But as of right now, no one has solved the riddle of what these 2 ciphers mean. All we know is that Ricky McCormick, a couple of weeks before he died, became increasingly paranoid and was so scared of someone or something that he was likely running into these hospitals just to hide out. But eventually, whoever or whatever Ricky was scared of very likely caught up to him and killed him. But until we crack these ciphers, we very likely will have no idea what actually happened to Ricky McCormick. Today, the FBI has set up a special website where you can look at these 2 ciphers that Ricky had in his pocket, and if you're able to crack them, because someone's going to eventually, you can tell the FBI through this website and potentially help solve Ricky's murder. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our other studios podcasts, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. All you have to do is search Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called